Can we start here? Huh? Before we get anything underway, I just wanted to share a few thoughts about the process in our office. Today, Jay Vanos, who some of you know as the SCI-Arc guy, came into my office to discuss the hinges on a project in the office. On my way over here tonight, I was thinking more about it. Huh? Every detail on our projects has to be considered, you know? What kind of finish is the hinge? Stainless steel, bronze, brushed aluminum, brass plated, huh? What kind of screws? Square drive, slotted, Phillips head? Maybe then we can have a discussion. I sent Jay over to SCI-Arc today to pick me up a veggie burger at Rick's lunch truck. In case you don't know, the veggie burger is a slab of veggie matter on a bun with all the regular burger stuff, huh? You know? In the patty itself are carrots, zucchini, celery, and red bell pepper. Perhaps we could have a polemical discussion about whether or not it has any right to be called a burger whatsoever. The veggie burger, though, is not unlike the hinge, you know? Both seem to operate more efficiently with a bit of grease. That's my little joke. I'm going to step down for a minute and give the mic over to a guy who's no stranger to various forms of vegetable creations. But that's another discussion. Mike Rotondi, you know?
Imagine that, sandwiched in between Eric and Eric. That's more than a veggie burger. Thanks, Pinto. Welcome. It's good to see a large group here this evening. The whole community is out. We're here to see each other and to see, listen, and learn from one of our own, a colleague, a friend, and a family member. I want to build instability, then obviate it, he once said. Beware, everything he says and does contains seeds for a revolution. This has always been true, I know. Those who understand what is at stake will grasp the power of his ideas and will also recognize the intellect, instinct, and passion brought to bear on architecture. To understand requires acceptance for the moment, to see and to hear what is present. For the next 90 minutes, or thereabouts, open yourself up to the possibility of changing your minds in light of this new experience tonight. Hear what is being said as living words that can grow into spaces that seem to be outside in. Yes, outside in. What you thought was going to be this is really that. Eric's work occupies the line in between one place, one thought, one feeling, and another. It is neither like this or like that. It is like itself, which is everything at once. Yet it brings into question everything at once, including itself. It is and it isn't. Is that possible? I've come to know that when I surrender to Eric's imagination, everything and anything seems to be possible. Gravity is only temporary, he once said. His buildings all float off the ground, but they don't appear to be light because they're solid. How can that be? Exactly the intent. Did that building just move, or is it vibrating? It's a fact that the only way you can truly know architecture is to experience it directly, occupy the space, and then begin to read the building. What it is, how it's made, and how it got to be that way. Their ordering systems are constructed in ways that trace their own trajectories and where they've been, but like subatomic particles, not where they're going. This is not a deception, it's a fact. The future is a concept that always gives way to the present. The lines that are drawn, both curved and straight, don't anticipate as much as they record what has just happened. An event has just been revealed by an archaeologist with the vision of a shaman. The physical has become the metaphysical. Are things falling apart or coming together? Either way, the center holds. And from this center, where the internal logic resides, the spaces and forms of the buildings emerge, the progeny of the city that they're embedded within. They have the same genetic code of the city, but a different consciousness. They do not look like anything I've seen before, but my body is signaling déjà vu. Like the after effects of a virtual experience, the city has more clarity. It is more intelligible, more coherent. In this moment, the part has become the whole. My imagination has shifted scales. From any place I stand, it seems that I'm seen from multiple vantage points. I can see the whole thing at once, or have I just imagined it to be so? I didn't know I could do that. I can't remember the last time. Maybe my mind's eye is quicker than the speed of light, or maybe I'm just smarter now than I was a moment ago. All I can be sure of is that at this moment I'm seen and thinking in a different way. I'm curious of how I'm thinking. I'm conscious of how I'm thinking. How did that happen? Will it ever happen again? Indeed, if I return to this place. What is this place? This is the place where the truth is vibrating because Eric is digging. He wants to go beneath what has been accepted as true to search for a bigger truth, perhaps the ultimate truth, which is unknowable. It takes courage to do this. Thank God someone is willing to try. Thank God for Eric. Please join me in welcoming a member of our family that's made us proud, Eric Owen Moss.
I recognize the last guy. Now, who the hell was the first guy? Before I start, I wanted to acknowledge, maybe all of you are familiar with this, but just in case a few missed it, there was an enormous event put on by the local AIA. You can flip the first two slides if you like. By the local AIA about a week and a half ago. I think masterminded by Tom Main, by Ray Cappy, and Nick Syrup, all of whom have histories at SCI-Arc. But what was extremely nice was to see Michele Sai pick up a couple of prizes, and Ginnick and Daly, who are young architects and a part of a burgeoning or moving community. And it was terrific to see that. This is not quite a plug for the AIA, which is not everything, obviously, but it seems to be somewhat more than it was in the last few years. Anyway, congratulations to those characters. This talk is not about hamburger stands, I hope. And I think I'm on ground that I'm not particularly familiar with. I found myself over the years running around and talking about work in a way that I began to be comfortable talking about. So I had a way of talking and a way of explaining and a way of understanding and I think a way of communicating. And it was received, I think it was understood as if I understood. I'm not so sure I really understood the content, but that I had come with a way of delivering. And what I thought I would do, SCI-Arc being the erstwhile home of experiment, to try to talk in a somewhat different way about the subject matter, or maybe an evolving subject matter. Mike said something about floating, and it reminded me, it just had an image of a Chagall figure somewhere. And I felt like that, I think, almost forever. And maybe some of you can share that, in the sense that we seem to move from one point to another point, or one architectural argument to another architectural argument, or one destination to the next destination, and on and on and on. And I was wondering whether a somewhat different demand could be made of architecture. And I don't say that it's deliverable, or that it would be deliverable by me or by any of you. But architecture seems, at least for me at the moment, a very tiny piece of something which is extraordinarily large, whatever is our experience, infinitely large. And notwithstanding the vanity of everyone who stands here every week talking about his or her work, it's a small piece of everything. And I think what I wanted to try to do was to stretch the content of architecture toward the infinite. I'm not saying it could reach, maybe it could be asymptotic to the infinite, but that it would take on, that it would have a destination, that it would have a goal, that it would have an aspiration. It couldn't be a shape or a form or a space. It couldn't be a physiological target. Maybe it's an emotional target. If you're talking to the corner psychiatrist, it might be a grounding, but something that would be durable, would be lasting, that could stand against the flux or the flow of one argument and the next argument. It could stand against the intellectual dialectic that seems to run forever. So, the Lord said to Moses, you knew it was coming. The Lord said to Moses, make a fiery serpent and set it on a pole. And all those who were bitten, when they see it, shall live. So the aspiration is that architecture would be the fiery serpent, that I could make that. I think not as an act of vanity, but as a way to heal or a way to cure, because assuming everyone is bitten, at least according to the Hebrew Bible, so if everyone is bitten, when they look on it, they'll live. They'll be cured. And the question is whether I can make that argument intelligible in architectural terms. And I think what I'm looking for is a way over the intellectual dialectic. Next, please. Which is represented in Akira Kurosawa's film, which is an old film, many of you familiar with, Rashomon. Rashomon being the gate of a temple in Kyoto. And the film dealing with the subject of a number of perspectives on an event which can or cannot be read back as an empirical truth for all those who love science and its priesthood. And my conclusion about this film is that the truth of the film is the tension between the possibilities or the perspectives that are introduced. And I mean this in an intellectual way, so it's not that this is so or that is so, but that a piece of this is plausible and a piece of that is conceivable, and what is so is actually not an allegiance to one or the other, not an allegiance to a point of view. I mean, in the most banal terms, the neo-modernist, or the new urbanist, or the deconstructivist, or no allegiances, but the truth being the tension between the perspectives. And that's where you want to try to find yourself. Now, this is an intellectual tension. It's an when I say intellectual, it's an arguable tension in the sense that somebody could say, this guy saw it accurately, or that guy saw it accurately. And what I'm interested in is realizing or sustaining that tension. It's plausible, it's tactile, it's tangible, but at the same time, understanding that that argument runs forever. And therefore, what I was looking for, or would try to argue for, or am trying to make a case that it might exist, is something that overcomes that transcends the dialectic. And what I've called that in the past is a lyric in an architectural sense, a poem. So that in the end, the fiery serpent would be both dialectical, meaning it could hold the tension of possible perspectives, but the making of the argument, not yakety-yak argument, but the making of the argument physiologically in architectural language, in the language of space, is the lyric. That means that the lyric transcends the dialectic, and in that sense, the fiery serpent is the lyric, the dialectical lyric that finally gives you a ground or a destination. So whether that's intelligible, I don't know, but this is no? So I'll try to make it a little bit less confusing, and probably with the opposite result, humility. Next. At the airport at JFK the other day, I picked up a book by Kundera, whom many of you know, The Unbearable Heaviness, and so on. But this is a different one, which I didn't know, called Slowness. And so we all know it. So this is on your left. This is the beginning of the 20th century, 100 years. And Kundera, the end of the 20th century. And it's two ways of looking at history, two ways of looking at time. But they're not so much opposites. I think one is, I don't know if there's such a word, outside. Extrovert, outside, speed, next step, next destination, progress, on and on and on. So this is Marinetti, burn everything, going, going, going. Where are we going? And Kundera saying something which, to be honest, I remember my father a long time ago telling me when I heard an expression, to be honest, I should duck. Because what was coming was sure as hell not honest. But I don't know quite how to get at the meaning. I think one has to do with moving, and the other has to do with stopping. And one has to do with looking at things from the outside, as if time runs. And the other has to do, and there are cultures like this. I think in some ways the Mayan culture, the owner, the progenitor of the ubiquitous snakes, or the Egyptoid culture, were cultures that didn't see time running, but saw it standing still. It doesn't go anywhere. And maybe the expression, which is a more contemporary expression, or not so contemporary, but maybe 50 years old, of T.S. Eliot, the still point of the turning world, is a way to ameliorate this. And I don't want to rip so much Marinetti. It's always easier to look behind you and try to point out where people should have gone. I think you might get to Kundera, to get to slowness, a different kind of essence or a different way of understanding via Marinetti. So I don't know whether you could skip one and get to the other, but in my time and in my experience, I think one finally led to a dead end. So that actually the fastest way to understand might be the slowest. I hope that doesn't sound like I'm running for mayor or something. Anyway, next, please. Tension in a spatial sense, the helmet by Henry Moore, which has been of some use to me in discussions like this over the last 2 or 3 years. A lot of the images that I use show up well after the work, but I find parallels or associations, and maybe this is of some help. It has to do with fitting and not fitting, or fit and misfit. And the helmet, as you know, comes over the head, is coincident with the eyes, ears, nose, mouth, throat, and all of that. So there's a congruency in the helmet as we know it, defined by Noah Webster. This is a different kind of helmet, and in a significant way, because the internal object is to some extent covered, protected, sequestered by the external, but the two are not coincident. So there's a relationship, but it's not a congruency. And the way I've used this, and we're now using it for the structure of a book, which is called Gnostic Architecture, so that the outside, the helmet starts with the outside of the outside, and then the inside of the outside, and then a space which we're now calling the glue. And then the outside of the inside and the inside of the inside, and the tension between those pieces, between an inside that doesn't quite fit with the outside, but they belong, and they don't. And maybe the experience of belonging and not belonging is a little bit the experience of everyone who has been bitten, but hasn't yet seen the fiery serpent on the pole. The other slide on your right is one of the Martian moons called Phobos. And it also is illustrative of a kind of, if Dr. Doolittle would be here, it would be the push me, pull you. But the tension between possibilities that are plausible in both directions simultaneously. The body actually is not a sphere, notwithstanding the prognosis that heavenly bodies would be spheres. It's clearly not. But one could understand it with reference to something Euclidean, meaning it's not quite that, but one could see it moving in that direction. But simultaneously, one could see the other possibility, which is that it's moving away from something that we could define in a geometric sense or in terms of writing an equation. So it seems to have both qualities, that is, moving away and moving toward, and doing that simultaneously. And I think this also fascinates me. Next, please. In the Lexicon of Phobos, a project for Mickey Friedman at the end of Manhattan, adjacent to the Hudson. For those interested, so the Hudson River is out here. This is the site. But in the Lexicon of Phobos, a debate or a dialogue between two spheres, one of which is known and understood as a sphere. The other of which is an attempt, in a way, to make a sphere out of pieces without quite knowing what is a sphere. And the two work on each other. Next, please. Again, in the Lexicon of Phobos, for Intel, a convention center, this piece, which is temporary, this piece, which is less temporary, in the port of Monaco, and a proposal to introduce dialogue at Bill Clinton's residence, which hasn't been built yet. Next, please. This goes back a few years, a house in the San Fernando Valley, and the beginnings of a discussion of how it would be made. And that this, which in the early studies is spherical, is now implemented with orthogonal pieces, so that what's round is never quite round. Next, please. This is, the title of this is What Wall, which comes from an essay that all of you probably know, In Defense of Architecture, by Le Corbusier, fighting off an attack by a Czech critic called Karl Teague. This is in the 30s, who was arguing that architecture in a way would make itself without architects, modular, brick or block. And Le Corbusier said, yeah, but what wall would be made finally, the implication being that the persona of the architect can't be divorced from the making of architecture. This object, which is about 6 meters by 6 meters, I don't quite know how to characterize it, a bump on a wall. I don't know whether to say it's post-Euclidean, which sounds like an effort to make it advanced beyond Euclid. I don't know if it is, might be pre-Euclidean, or maybe Euclid is irrelevant, but it has actually to do, I think it's the most complicated thing we have made that is being built. There are about 800 blocks in it, and each one is specially cut. Next, please. So post, pre, or irrelevant. The label has yet to be determined. And the frame which supports it, the issue of structure in a constructive sense, in the association with shape or form, that is the relationship between shape and form, and the literal physical structure is of some interest here, because the wall determines the structure, a series of pipes, 3-inch diameter pipes, which fit in to the back of the wall. So the structure takes the lead, or follows the lead of the wall, as do the windows, the glass, the blinds, and all of that. Next. A slightly different vantage point, but I think somewhat similar subject matter. How you see, how one sees. So how one sees, and if you remember Tiresias, also how one understands. So assuming see and see have that double meaning. And this is Sunday in the Park, which is a well-known painting, end of the 19th century, Banks of the Seine, by Seurat. But what makes it poignant, I think, in this context, is that the technique of the painting, which you know, is the dot technique, which was an unusual technique, an exploratory technique, an experimental technique, and rendered the figures in a very particular way. But the figures, in a sociological way, lined up on the banks of the Seine, and everyone is behaving and so on. In a sociological way, very conservative and predictable. So a way of seeing and understanding maybe the technique dismantles the sociology to a degree, but they exist together an exploratory technique in a more conservative sociology. And what I'm calling this, I have a label for this, is recollecting forward. And I think that the issue, Marinetti's issue of burn what's behind you, for me now being replaced by some sense both of discontinuity, which interested him, and continuity simultaneously. So forward and backward, recollecting forward. I think, a slightly different vantage point again, but similar subject matter. The city reflecting itself, or how the city understands what it is in order to know what it was and what it should become. And the danger that the city would only understand itself in terms of what it was, and therefore Mr. Vincent Scully, Mr. Lampagnani, and so on, Mr. Prince of Wales, would only continue to make itself in the image that it knew, Narcissus, and therefore drown itself. Next, please. And some, for instances of what I call recollecting forward, the Plaza Vieja, which we renamed the Plaza Vieja Nueva in the medieval section of Havana. This is, I think, the 17th district in Vienna, the Ottring brewery, an old brewery with a very substantial series of additions. Next, please. The infamous Tours project with 18th century classroom buildings and chapel, 20th century high school, and the intervention of a theater and a museum. A Punic, this is in Spain, this is an enormous project of which you see a piece, but a Punic mausoleum in the midst of a somewhat different escapade. Next, please. And back to local circumstances, recollecting forward, a project which I'd like to refer to, long running, but I'd like to refer to as the history of a line. And the line, essentially a half mile of abandoned railway right-of-way, which it has been tackled in two ways. One, to re-emphasize the line, the abandoned line, and building over it, to emphasize it, to stress it, to exacerbate it. And secondly, to make an alternate prospect or strategy, which runs in contradiction to the line, runs across buildings that are adjacent to the line, and therefore posits buildings over buildings, e.g. Next, please. The original proposal for that project, which stretched the program beyond what it finally could carry, with the theater on one end and a large lobby and office and conference space, and recollecting a series of bowstring truss pairs spanning, just to give you a scale, about 50 feet. Next, please. And then the building over the building, contradicting the line. Next, please. There's a theoretical figure that makes the lobby or the central area of this building, which runs counter to two fundamental systems or orders in the building. One, the structural frame, which is steel tubes, tube columns, and wide flange beams, and the other, the bowstring trusses, which run through the building. So this is a kind of ethereal, theoretical anomaly, which is and isn't in various pieces as you move from the front of the building to the lobby of the building to the conference room in the building. So it exists as in a drawn sense, in a theoretical sense, it exists as an entity, but you can't quite find it as you move through the space. But it has an identity. It's not just pieces. It's not just fragments that don't go anywhere. You can bring it back to a conclusion if you could put the building back together, run the building forward and backward in a deconstructed sense, which you cannot. This is an antecedent, I think somewhat more, about 10, 12 years earlier, a more recognizable figure in a space. Next, please. Not sure whether I made this clear, but the figure, the theoretical figure of the lobby, which exists as a whole in concept, but not as a whole literally, and shows itself in pieces, the slot out of the conference room, the arms, the cut, the kind of fossilized cut of the shape in the front wall. Next, please. And then inside the outside, the making of the lobby. Next, please. And you get a little bit the sense of both the opacity and the transparency, so in a space, through the next space, to the final space, all of which, if you could add them up, would make a single figure. Next, please. So the issue of the relationship of the shape or the figure to what supports it in a constructed sense, and how that's expressed. Next, please. The recollecting forward, the association with the original structure on the site, the legs of which actually stand for a pedestrian circulation way that runs up about 4 levels with light filtering through. And then the back end of the object in this space, which is a conference space, the extension of the truss system, and then the glazing, double glazing, which seals the conference space as the object moves that way into the lobby and then out the front of the building. Next, please. The all-at-once shot of the roller coaster on the north elevation, connections between deck levels. Next, please. And then from a very different vantage point, Rashomon-like, and this is certainly an interest in the work in being able to reveal a series of pieces from a number of different vantage points. So you either think you come to know finally what the object is, having seen it from the outside and the inside, or wonder at it. Next, please. Next. So 4 examples of the bridge of size. And then we saw it from the north wall, from inside the building, and then a typical condition looking at it from underneath. And then the frame, the steel frame, and the wood frame, and then the anomaly of the lobby. Next, please. The second issue with the history of the line was a building that emphasized, exacerbated, reiterated the presence of that line, albeit in a somewhat different form and use than the original use, which was, of course, the railroad track. In this drawing, which is one of a series, an indication of an enclosure of space along the line, which was entitled The Curtain. This is a different site, but the proposition is the same. The block in the air over the road being the line that we're writing a continuing history of. Next, please. The original block model, or blocks model, it finally came to be one block in the air over the road, the original site. Next, please. And to look at it from a distance, Maybe this is too easy a discussion about Los Angeles and that it's about freeways and infrastructure and all of that, which would have to be discussed in more detail. But in any event, the infrastructure of the banks of the, not the Seine in this case, and the bridges and the power poles and KABC and the block in the air. So in the most abstract way, understood simply as a block in the air, a part of the infrastructure that makes the city. Next, please. And from the southwest and from the northwest, in an association with a number of existing buildings, the entry road here. Next, please. So this is the line. Next, please. And the inside of the outside, and maybe the outside of the inside. I think sometimes this is referred to as inside the pumpkin, but not by me. Next. Maybe by you. And that entry object from the top down and from the bottom up, entry to the road. Next, please. And the Champs-Élysées of Jefferson and La Cienega in here and out here, and every girder, of course. Thank you very much, Jean Prouvé. Every girder is absolutely the same. Every girder is absolutely different. And the columns here removed so that the trucks can go in the far in here and out on that end. Next, please. This always reminded me, I don't know if this will be taken facetiously, of that view in the courtyard of the Salk Institute looking out over the sea. The sea is a little bit different in this case, which is a sea of industry, but there is, so in here and out here, but there is a question always about what you're looking at in an area like this, which is likely to be extremely ephemeral. So what you see is not likely to be what you see in 5 or 10 or 15 years from now, as the area transforms in quite a radical way. Certainly a neglected area in this city, but hopefully not for long. Next. Looking down on what really is the second anomaly to the block, and then a double height space in the interior. Next. And the original study model, this being the end of the block, that block is about 100 meters long, and there was a proposal for a second phase, which was referred to as the hook, but developing a more introverted space as opposed to the line, which was about something more extroverted. And then in the recent period, there have been a number of schemes over the years proposed, and now with the support of the city and the mayor's office and the local council character, the criteria for the site has changed. The general plan for the city has been amended. The height limits are different, the setbacks are different, and we're looking at buildings of a very different scale. There was a particular issue, I don't quite know how to refer to what's going on at the top of that building. It's a kind of microwaving in an orthogonal way. So if orthogonal microwaving is intelligible, then that's what it is. Next, please. And just to extend that discussion for a moment, this was a department store in Santa Monica with that microwave to find a way to adjust fairly subtly points of entry, and a similar condition in a restaurant that we're making. Next, please. This is actually the corner of Jefferson and Jefferson, in case you don't recognize it. leading this way to La Cienega. And I think the presumption of these tower buildings that we're proposing has really to do with an assumption that corner is a center and a focal point with respect to seeing and being seen from a number of critical points in the city. And so out of that language came a language for two very big buildings, 235 feet high, but with very large floor-to-floor heights, with 18-foot floor-to-floor heights, so that the intention is not to make more big buildings with outsides and no insides, but to try to learn from our experiences with low-rise buildings and somehow to transform or to transfer the experience of big spaces that are horizontal to big spaces in a building which is essentially vertical. So this is the first building, the second phase, and the third phase, the two towers. Next, please. Which we actually just have begun to work on. And as a study which seems to further that investigation of what this frame actually means, which is something we discuss next time. Not next time, hang on. We're making an exhibition in the Wexner, which is an investigation of that language of the building that grows vertically out of a conceptual center. So early study model of the towers and the sketch for the installation in Peter Eisenman's building. Next, please. And so this is gallery 4 for those of you who know it. So the frame, I think we're out of light here, but the frame which is part of the lingo of the Wexner, and then what has come to be called the dancing bleachers, the installation which will open in January next year. Next, please. Two laws that I'd like to talk about, if I haven't buried you already with biblical quotations. One, the Pythagorean diagram, which I've used before, I think which has to do with a conceptual understanding that's based on measure or number. If you look long enough with a strong enough electron microscope, you can find the order and the structure of everything. In other words, from a scientific point of view, everything is available. It's just a matter of time and patience. So this is the law, supposed, and I think for a very long time, any number of generations thought that was the only law. This may also tie into Marinetti and the idea of progress. So the more things that are discovered and uncovered, it gets better and better, and in a kind of zippity-doo-dah way. I don't want to totally trivialize it, but there's another law which sticks its face into your life very strangely and powerfully, which, again, I'm not quite sure how to represent, but this a painting of Rembrandt with God telling Abraham to take Isaac to Mount Moriah and to kill him. And what law is that? And who would do that? And what does this mean? Or how does this relate to this? And is there a way to make that law or that experience in human affairs, in the tiny domain of architecture, can it be realized? Could we talk about it? Could we build Abraham on the way to Mount Moriah? So the answer to that is in the next lecture. Next. But as a manifestation of the previous slide on left and right, the ubiquitous grid, what's Cartesian, what's quantitative, what's measurable, all of that dumped, of course, on the surface of the moon. because the way to understand the moon is to grid it off and to measure it. But I think it's clear to me that the moon really doesn't give a damn about our grid. Next, please. In the beginning of an effort to realize that voice, the starting of a discussion, this is the Jewish Museum in San Francisco, a project which is not a design, but the beginning of thinking about a subject. It's not a museum, so this is a euphemism really for a center to try to understand what does it mean to be a Jew at the end of the 20th century. So they called it a museum, but this is really not what it is. And this is a photograph of the stairway into the quarry, which is a stunning experience and by no means communicated in the slide, which looks like a fairly innocent stair. But a quarry dug by slave labor at Mauthausen, which is not far from Vienna, that I went to see 2 or 3 years ago. So the surface of the land is stone originally. It's up here, and down and down and down it goes. And as the cuts are made and as the stone is quarried and carried away, the steps are cut into the quarry. And then the stone is carried out on the steps. And I think the reason I wanted to use it is that it seemed to me that it was part of the subject matter of this discussion, not somehow to whine about. I don't know quite how to represent it, but the stair is a way in, the subject matter is a way in, but the stair is also a way out. So that you have to go in it, or you have to go through it in order to somehow absorb it and take it to the next place. A little bit like you got to know Marinetti before you meet Kundera. Anyway, there's an existing historic power station on the site. It's about 16,000 square feet. The whole project is about 80, and then there's another fairly substantial piece unbuilt. And the two have to have some sort of association. Next, please. In the beginning of a study of this area is the unbuilt, and this is the power station, and there are a series of lines drawn on the floor which then come to be associated with pre-existing lines at the edge of the skylight, making a series of walls which begin to subdivide the spaces, because of course the programmatic content in the power station is very different than in the succeeding project. Next, please. And the beginning of a representation of the division of that space. Next, please. The problem of the language of expression of various artistic endeavors, how to describe it, how to limit it, how to say what they are. So this is probably not how to say what they are, but how to say that we don't know at this point how to say that. This is John Cage with a musical score which is done visually first and auditorially, if that's a word, second. And this is James Joyce, which is quite old now, but in Ulysses, so a musical score as literature. So what's music? Or what's literature? Or what's architecture? Next. What's a box? The box that is and is not the box, and then a discussion of that subject with a conference center that has come to be known as the Beehive, which is about to be constructed next, which has two aspects. Its literal physical aspect, its current form and order and shape and all of that. But it also holds a method or a mechanism for building, I don't want to say infinitely variable, this is impossible, but an extremely variable space There are a series of legs or columns, 4 in this case, that are tubes, and they bend at various points for various reasons. I shouldn't say bend, they break and take off in different directions. And they're then followed by beams, which are pipes. So first the column, and it goes on its journey. And the beam which follows the column, and then there's a skin or completion or closure which follows the beam. Next, please. This is a study model of that, of the column, for instance, and the pipe follows the column, and the skin, glass here, and steel here follow the beams. Next, please. And from the inside, the conference level, the column on its journey, up to the sky, down to the ground. Next, please. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, in despair. I know, Margie knows that, at least. Somebody. This is an old poem by Shelley, allegedly written by an omnipotent king who wanted to demonstrate his potency with some colossal building. But the despair, in a human sense, in an individual sense, in an existential sense, if that word is not totally worn out, is that nobody can do that. It comes and it goes. And over the top, the grass grows. So what is all the fuss about? Next. Again, a building, the previous slide on the right, which I didn't elaborate on, maybe should have, was taken in Chichen Itza a couple of years ago, and actually is a series of buildings by a number of groups, one pushing aside the previous one, building over time. This is a project that I think I've been putting up on walls for about 4 or 5 years, and is now about to be constructed in this excavation or hole, which is the site of what is called euphemistically remedial action, which means the conditions of the earth are other than what they should be and have to be cleansed. And in fact, that was done. Next, please. And the hole or excavation is here. As a consequence, this bowstring building was removed, or the bowstring building was removed in order to do the excavation. The excavation becomes a theater on the outside, which seats about 600 people. The building behind becomes a stage. Next, please. And a wall is built. The dimension of the wall is about 60 feet high, going downhill from left to right, and the length of the wall is about 325 feet. So the wall demarcates the end of the second bowstring and the beginning of the new building, which in a conceptual way is hung off it. This is the theater area with a long span, the truss. Next, please. Next. The section actually, I mean, for me, when I talk about the Samotar building, the block in the air as a piece of infrastructure, and then the exceptions to the block, and I showed you 2 of them, the entry stair and the area with the bridge and the pool. I think this building is a little bit different in conception, at least as I understand it. It's a perpetual anomaly, meaning there is no consistent section, but over its length, the section changes consistently or continues to change. I guess the question of consistency is an issue in my mind, and when I look at it, and I don't know the answer to this, whether the evolution or the movement of the building from one end, which is 3-sided and recognizable, to the other end, which is four-sided and recognizable, and back, whether that movement or change is predictable, and if it is, whether there would be a way to make that kind of perpetual change, but not in a directional way, not in a predictable way. Essentially, the surface of the building is made by associating a three-sided figure and a four-sided figure over 325 feet with planes. There are no hyperbolic surfaces. And then the longitudinal section, the theater that you recognize. Next, please. That I mentioned a moment ago. And the frame, we actually are in the process of just completing a literal model, a physical model of the structural frame because of the precarious relationship of the structure of the building, of the steel of the building, to the skin, and with essentially no tolerance across that 325-foot dimension. So to ensure that each piece is made and understood, there are actually, in concept, three structural systems. One, the long span, the truss, which exists in this plane and also at the wall, over the area of the theater, and then a shorter span system that has really to do with dealing with the elevator core and stairways, and then a more regular column system at the far end of the building. Next, please. Next. The second of these revived Chichen Itza approaches is near the airport in Vienna. The four gasometers that are constructions that took place at the end of the 19th century held natural gas, which was then pumped into the city of Vienna. And of course that use dissipated and disappeared. Dimensionally, the buildings, the gasometers, are about 65 meters high, about 60 meters in diameter. This gives you a little bit of an idea. The interior, which is concrete, the exterior, which is brick, the roof, which is steel and wood. But the making of the wall, of the apertures in the wall, of course, in the city of Freud, was to make it appear that the building was inhabited, so that from the Autobahn it looks to have a residential aspect, but of course the contents were industrial contents. Next, please. And the assignment for four architects by the developer was to put into the gasometer what they call social housing. It's essentially a housing project, multi-unit, high-rise housing project inside the tank, along with some retail and a public gathering space. And the project essentially had three components. One called the pentasphere, which is not unlike the element on Vesey Street at the end of Manhattan that I showed just briefly. The second, the wedges. And without going into a long exegesis, the wedges have to do with light, the rules of light in living units from the city building code of Vienna, which is somewhat complex, but every lived-in room has to have a percentage of light for a percentage of the day, the consequence of which is the cutting of the object into these very narrow wedges, and further the removal of the roof, and then the positioning of this, which is called the gyro. So the pentasphere and the wedges and the gyro. Next, please. And one plan suffices in this context. Actually, the entry-level plan, which is contiguous with the other gasometers, so retail and public space, and a for instance of the making of the wedges. Next, please. And the gyro and the building in section. Next, please. Almost out of the exterior wall, the pentasphere, the wedges, and the gyro. The rules were that you couldn't cut the existing roof, but the rules were bent a little bit in this discussion. Next, please. This is, the client actually has asked that the project not be named or the site not be named. Umberto Eco has a new book called The Island of the Day Before, which is a beautiful name. So I'll borrow that and let's say this is the island of the day before. An old Roman port originally. The site is this. This is the plains of Nazca in the Peruvian highlands, which I show, I think because I had no idea how to begin the project or how to do a project of this scale. It's a mile long and a quarter of a mile wide. And essentially, as I came to understand Nazca is really about building the rules, saying what the culture is, etching the culture and its credo into the desert in perpetuity. Next, please. So to begin to etch the culture into the island of the day before, this light's gone, but the slide on the left is a very old drawing, old zoning, old rules. Project begins, God damn it. Well, I can get this one somehow. So this area into the sea, top of the hill. The zoning goes from green, you can't build here, to something which is called protected, to less protected, so that as one descends from the top of the hill toward the sea, the allowable density in the previous prescription was to increase. Next, please. And very briefly, the etch or the beginning of the building of the rules. And this is Scorpio, which has a 2,500-year history on the island. It seems to be the constellation of favor on the island. And so this will be new as a kind of city planning theory, but the association with the constellation and its history and a need to etch or cut or build station points or seeing points or vantage points or pivot points, seeing meaning seeing and understanding, actually on the edge of the green zone. So this is the beginning of the etching of the site, bringing the sky to the land. Excuse me while I kiss the sky. Thank you. Thank you, Jimi Hendrix. Next, please. Finally found a reference you like. Uh-oh. Keep smiling. On the right, oh, thanks. The site located here, and in a pragmatic way to make the, next, on the left. To make the argument from the client's point of view about the meaning of those station points or viewing points or understanding points, bringing the land and the sky together, bringing Scorpio and the site together, building the rules, etching the site, and a series of those vantage points. Next, please, in an early drawing. I'll show one building, which is the building on the site, which is not buildable, up to this up to this point. We called it the Church of the Museum, and since you can't build on the land, we built in the land and over the land. Essentially, in the museum, there are these slots which run perpendicular to this walk, which runs down the hill and onto the sea. And each culture which has left a residue of its belief system on the island has statuary at the end of each slot. So there's a statue and one enters the slot for the Carthaginians or the Phoenicians or the Vandals or whatever it is, and beyond, and sees that statuary and beyond the sea. So the church of the burgeoning church of the museum. And finally, next. On the left, a photograph or a drawing from a photograph or a drawing of a photograph of that asteroid bumping into Jupiter, just to give a sense of the impossible volatility of all of this, so that all of our aspirations for rule or order or understanding come apart in a moment. I'm not sure exactly how this is connected to Marinetti. Maybe it is, in the sense that it seems to imply at one level that it keeps moving and it keeps changing and you can't catch up with it, and it's too big for you and too powerful for you, and we can't control it, all of that. The colossal volatility of everything, notwithstanding a kind of veneer of rules and laws and roads, and all of a sudden it's gone. Culture after culture, Angkor Wat, Chichen Itza, maybe someday Los Angeles, but on and on. The other slide is, so this is the year 2000, this is the year 0, roughly speaking. This is a Gnostic talisman that belongs to the early Christian era, and the head is the rooster and the light, and the tail is the serpent, all of that. But this is in time for all time, and this is transcending time, the aspiration. In other words, history or time wouldn't be circular or linear or whatever it wouldn't be Hegel, and it wouldn't be Toynbee, and it wouldn't be Mickey Mouse's watch. It wouldn't be any of those things, in a certain sense that it doesn't go anywhere, that it transcends as an experience, the volatility of asteroids on Jupiter. And if you could put the fiery serpent together with the Gnostic talisman, and if architecture could begin to describe that voice both dialectically and intellectually as on Jupiter, or lyrically as a transcendence, then we might be going somewhere or nowhere. Thank you very much.